I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Deloff, and I am exercising my freedom of speech.
And I'm Matt Bernico, and I'm also going to exercise my freedom of speech right now on this podcast. Try and stop me.
A podcast is like an exercise bike for your speech. That's how you exercise it.
I'm glad that someone's finally saying it. For too long, people have been silent on this fact about the similarity between podcasts and exercise bikes for speech.
That's right. Cancel me if you must, but someone had to say it.
Someone had to, and it had to be you. So let's see. There's so many things going on right now. There is actively a pandemic. There is an uprising that is basically not going to end. There are murder hornets. There's a big bad storm the other day. that one. There's a tropical storm. I can't remember. There's so many bad things keep happening. But this week there's only one thing that the libs are mad about, and that's cancel culture and the freedom of speech. Yikes. You might have heard about a big dumb letter that got published in Harper's Magazine, which is a magazine I didn't know existed even because I am an underread ding dong. It was signed by all your problematic faves, or just problematics, like J.K. Rowling, Noam Chomsky, Steven Pinker, David Brooks, etc. That list got worse and worse as I read it. Well, I don't know. It's all bad across the board. Anyways, basically, if you don't know anything about it, it was a letter that was co-signed by all of these kind of famous writers, cautioning everyone as a society, I guess, against being too quick to dunk and, quote, cancel celebrities for their bad takes. That's what the letter was about. And it is an annoying article because, well, I mean, first of all, it's like kind of famous writers whining about people being mean to them on the internet, which is fun. But also, it is trying to get people to just be less quick to dunk on J.K. Rowling for her like transphobia or whatever, right? People who have racist and sexist and transphobic ideas want an easy out, so they're trying to make the space for that. Anyways, all this guy's thinking, since this piece sucks, is there a better and more Marxist way to think about freedom and speech? This is the question that Dean and I are always asking one another. Is there a more Marxist way to do this? So in light of all this, we thought we could quickly talk about how stupid this Harper's letter is, and then run down some other approaches to freedom and speech and the freedom of speech. There you go. But from this more Marxist perspective. So in the end, I think that what we'll find is that when it comes to any freedom under capitalism, it always serves bourgeois interests and finds ways to make an exception to or just circumvent the freedom of people on the left overall. Well, we'll get some fun examples of that in a little bit that maybe explicate like what that freedom actually means in capitalism. But first, Dean, what's up with this dang letter?
Oh, man. So much. I should say, too, I should remind everyone, this is also a podcast about Christianity, and we'll get there. Don't worry. We'll get to the Marxism and the Christianity. Wouldn't you know, there's all kinds of stuff going on in Christianity about freedom, good and bad. But the Marxist stuff is always far more fun and interesting. But you're gonna have to wait on the edge of your seat, I'm sure, before we get there, because we got to talk through this Harper's letter. Um, I don't know, the actual content of the letter is kind of irrelevant. We can read a little bit of it to give you a flavor, but I think the general sentiment is not something that you haven't seen before. This isn't exactly cutting edge stuff, if you will. But the cultural response to it, I think, is also interesting, and also the way that certain signatories have tried to react to the letter is also kind of interesting. So anyway, let me read just one passage from it, and we can just talk a little about what it's actually saying and what that means about liberalism generally. So the letter says, our cultural institutions are facing a moment of trial. Powerful protests for racial and social justice are leading to overdue demands for police reform, along with wider calls for greater equality and inclusion across our society, not least in higher education, journalism, philanthropy, and the arts. But this needed reckoning has also intensified a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of differences in favor of ideological conformity. As we applaud the first development, we also raise our voices against the second. The forces of illiberalism are gaining strength throughout the world and have a powerful ally in Donald Trump, who represents a real threat to democracy. I think this is actually kind of an interesting paragraph to talk about because there's sort of a lot happening, and rhetorically, it's trying to pull you in a direction that you shouldn't go in. Don't be seduced by the siren's call of this bad prose. Maybe we could talk about a couple contradictions there and go forward. I think one of them, just to get on the table, is there's sort of a sleight of hand here, right? Because there's a promise, first of all, that these are all good people who care about justice in society, and probably a lot of them are, right? That's fine. But there's a sort of boogeyman or spooky ghost that comes up in here about this erosion of democratic norms or open debate. And that is something you might associate with maybe left-wing cancel culture. That's kind of what the letter is trying to get you to associate it with first. But then at the very end, you find out that actually, if that's how you're acting, you're more like Donald Trump than anybody else. So this is, I think, the sort of strange rhetorical move that's being made here. And I think we should not draw lines so quickly from one to the other, from A to B. Matt, what do you think of this kind of passage in the article generally?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right to pull out that that weird conflation of the illiberalism of the left and also Donald Trump. I think what's really important about this paragraph is like what's being left unstated. That's I think a really powerful point of rhetoric is like when you can kind of just vaguely flesh out a problem but never really get to what the problem is, so you can let your audience fill it in for you. It could be the left, it could be the right. Who could possibly know? Right. That's basically what this opening paragraph does. It sets up a space where we can put our own boogeyman in there, right? It's either the radical left or it's the crazy far right. It's one of these two, but we're not sure which. um Anyways, I think it's frustrating that okay, right. So it's saying on the one hand, we have all of these conversations and movements going on for racial and social justice, and that's great. At the same time, though, we have to be weary. We have to be leery of this new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that might weaken our norms. It's like, which ones are you talking about? The ones that will call you out on your bullshit, or something else? Right?
Yeah.
Like being intolerant of people being transphobic is good, actually. Being intolerant of racism is good, actually. And you can't frame people hating other people for really superfluous reasons as like a point of debate. You shouldn't be able to debate racism. It should just be obviously bad and wrong. um so, anyways, that's what they're trying to get rid of, though, right? Like, we don't want to be so quick to get rid of the norms of these democratic debates. We should just have an open marketplace of ideas where people can say what they think, and then we'll just debate them. We'll debate whether or not, people deserve dignity and respect, and that's some real dumb stuff.
All right. So, in light of all these big challenges, there is a solution offered by this essay, though, Matt. And I don't know if you caught that. I mean, we've been talking about the problem, but it's the solution that's the real key. And the way that these
So important.
signatories put it, it's very important, is the way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away. We refuse any false choice between justice and freedom, which cannot exist without each other. As writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, risk-taking, and even mistakes. We need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. If we won't defend the very thing on which our work depends, we shouldn't expect the public or the state to defend it for us. Pretty ominous ending here.
So frustrating. I hate this.
Yeah, what's so frustrating about it? Why do you hate it, Matt? It just feels like some people who are really down with justice and freedom.
Right. It sounds that way, but in fact, what this is asking for is a world free of consequences. How can we create a culture where we, as writers, do not have to be held accountable for the things that we say? Is what this is asking. It's so frustrating because it's not like, okay, as writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, risk taking, and even mistakes. Yeah, like using the wrong "your" is a mistake. Using the wrong "there" is a mistake. Being wrong about something is fine, but like, but being racist or being misogynistic or being sexist or being transphobic, these are not mistakes. These are things you're doing.
Are you
on
sure they're not
purpose.
experiments or risks?
No, I mean, it's definitely a risk to stay it, and it should be like. It's ridiculous to talk this way though. To like, don't whether or not you like you think that a pizza is a pizza or it's an open faced sandwich. Now that's something we can have a disagreement about. But like,
Yeah, that's a
whether you
risk.
think, whether you think trans people deserve dignity and that's not a disagreement. That's just like, are you a bad person or not? And I think that the point of this letter is to create rhetoric and make an opening so that people can be free from the consequences of their words. And no, thank you. I think I will hold them accountable. Still, I will be
Yeah.
the illiberal cancel culture of the left because that is ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, there's a very kind of immature notion of libertarian freedom. I think that's at work here, right? Like, this is a paragraph that could be written by, like, I don't know, a 14-year-old who read Ayn Rand and is in your creative writing class or something. And that's not what you want out of all these luminaries. But I think what's especially frustrating to me about it is that it paints a picture of a kind of growing authoritarian illiberalism that is really coming for writers. They end on a note that we shouldn't expect the public or the state to defend these things. And like, the state is not targeting you right now. I mean, Donald Trump is annoying, and like sometimes he forces like reporters to not be in the room or something. And we could talk about that, but even that isn't what's happening here, right? Donald Trump doesn't care if you say something that's transphobic. In fact, he'll probably just retweet you, right? These are insinuations that there's a growing enemy that doesn't actually exist. I think that is quite frustrating. I think also the insinuation that writers are in a sort of class of their own is a really romantic idea that frankly doesn't actually matter. I mean, I don't know. I'm in academia, so I meet all kinds of people who think about themselves this way all the time, but it's this assumption that you're kind of entitled to the brilliant brain that you've been given and slowly cultivated over whiskeys and bourbons and whatever at nighttime, torturing your inner soul to be able to write a great New Yorker piece. And it's like, I'm sorry, you're not that important. Especially if you're going to say something racist, you're definitely not that important. And that's really the trouble here. I want to say, so I've been following, there's all kinds of, like I said earlier, signatories have gone on to say more about this, right? Why did I sign it? All that kind of stuff. And most of it's not worth your time. But the most kind of bizarre one, because it is also coming from a place that might seem like a good one, was one from Jeet Heer, who I think is, he's a left liberal guy. A lot of Marxists don't like him, and I can understand why, but I appreciate him for who he is and what he does. And he signed it. And his reasoning that he said on Twitter was he doesn't like that cancel culture means basically throwing people into a really precarious workforce because there's no safety net to catch them if they just get fired all of a sudden, which is true. And that's bad, right? Like your healthcare shouldn't be tied to your job, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, first of all, that's not really what's going on here, right? That's not the concern. I don't think, at least, not what the letter is after. And secondly, I have to say, as a person who is a very precarious writer and who is already out amongst the wolves, nobody is affirming my free speech by giving me a lot of money and airtime to say whatever dumb stuff I want to say. So, in that sense, the concern just sort of falls flat, right? Like, even the best defense of it, I think, just sort of doesn't hold up. So, at the end of the day, I think what really comes through here for me, at least, is something that is centered on a really adolescent understanding of freedom, right? Just an idea of what people are entitled to that doesn't really have any kind of bearing on our actual experience in the world. And so the big question is, why invoke that kind of freedom? If it's not reflective of something in real life, then what's the sort of strategic work that it does? That's the rhetorical question I think I'm always invested in.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good explanation of kind of like what's going on, why this is so silly. Well, this podcast is here to tell you that both Marxists and also Christians, this extremely bizarre intersection that we've created, have some bigger and more interesting ideas about freedom and like what it's all about. So to get at some of those big ideas, Dean, I'm going to tell you something that's going to flip your whole world upside down.
Oh, I'm ready. This sounds like a real
Okay.
risk that you're taking.
Yeah, I hope I don't get canceled for it. So J.K. Rowling, Noam Chomsky, Steven Pinker, David Brooks, all these people, they're really concerned about free speech. But guess who else was once concerned about free speech? The IWW. Oh my gosh, can you believe that?
Whoa.
I know. I know. If I wasn't already canceled, I bet somebody would pay me to write a big think piece about this one. So here's something you might not know. The IWW in the early 1900s were just embroiled in these things called the free speech fights, where, well, here, I'll just read this excerpt. So this is from a book.
Wait. Let me even back you up further. Can you just explain who the IWW even are?
Oh, right. I forgot. If you're a first time listener to this podcast, the IWW is an acronym for the Industrial Workers of the World, which is a extremely radical labor union that started in 1905 and was really pretty big in the early 1900s, but then waned in popularity due to a lot of reasons that we don't need to talk about right now. Um, in a book called Wobblies of the World, written by Peter Cole and David Struthers, they're the editors. It's kind of like a collection of essays about the IWW around the world. They give this cool explanation, this really really to the point explanation of IWW and like why they were interested in free speech and like what's going on there. So I'm going to read this excerpt from their book that will help kind of explain what's going on and why the what the IWW and J.K. Rowling has in common. That's my clickbait heading for this one. Okay,
Right.
it's actually nothing, but but here we go. So Peter Cole and David Struthers, they write this. The IWW's free speech fights proved among the most noteworthy chapters in its U.S. history. The first broke out in 1909 in Spokane, Washington, an important employment center in the Pacific Northwest for migratory workers in timber, agriculture, and construction. Many laborers wintered in Spokane until work picked up in the spring, but employment sharks preyed on these workers by collaborating with employers by charging fees for jobs. In response, wobbly street speakers in Spokane urged workers to boycott the sharks and forced employers to hire workers directly without fees. And then it goes on to say a little bit later, the IWW announced its first free speech fight when the Industrial Worker, which was their newspaper, announced "Wanted men to fill the jails of Spokane." It's a good a good ad. So sure enough, Footloose Wobblies. Footloose Wobblies meant like migratory wobblies. The wobblies without a just one central place to call home. People who are riding the rails and living that good lifestyle. Footloose Wobblies traveled to Spokane and deliberately broke this law. The law was that labor organizers couldn't show up in Spokane and try to boycott the Sharks. So they went to Spokane. They deliberately broke the law, and the city arrested them. 500 in the first month. After 4 months of beatings and arrests, with the jails overflowing, the IWW won. All its members were released from prison. The ordinance was overturned, and the licenses of sharks were revoked. So, despite the victory, other cities copied Spokane's repressive efforts, and some of these cities beat back the IWW's organizing efforts. But these types of free speech fights would kind of crop up all over the place, right? These cities would have these like very predatory hiring practices of exploiting workers and basically ripping them off. And the Wobblies would show up, and they would pull out their soapbox, and they would get up in the middle of the street and tell everyone how they should boycott the sharks, they should join a union, all this kind of stuff, join the IWW. And that soapboxing was illegal in Spokane, and it would be illegal in a lot of other places. So they would get thrown in jail. But the sort of the wobbly tactic was that the IWW tactic. Wobblies is a nickname for the IWW, in case you didn't know. The IWW tactic was just like, okay, if they're gonna arrest us, fine. Then like, how about we just all come here? And they all did. They just flooded the jails. Too many of these IWW organizers showing up and just jamming the whole thing up. And in the end, they won. But anyways, like I said, this is like the first of other free speech fights where this kind of thing would happen. But it's kind of an interesting thing, right? Where speech is actually being censored in this like, it's not cancel culture, but it's like, you're gonna go to jail. You're gonna go to jail if you try to organize a union here. It's a little bit different, I think, than J.K. Rowling's situation, but I think it's kind of an interesting thing, right? That they really that free speech is good when it's used for something good, but the governments of in this case Spokane, but other places too, don't have any problem shutting you down if you're trying to stir up trouble, right? If you're trying to really throw the bourgeois order of things into question, that's when free speech is okay to be infringed upon.
Yeah. I mean, the left in the United States, I think, always has a really interesting and complicated relationship to law and to the Constitution and the rights that people are guaranteed, etc. We can talk about some other examples in a minute, I guess. But what I always find so fascinating about the Wobblies and the free speech fights is that they're basically, I think, calling the bluff of liberalism, because a liberal will hear the story and say, like, yes, but look, they've appealed to the constitutional protection and it worked. They did it. But in fact, what the IWW did is they got a bunch of people to go to jail and created a big problem. And
right. The Constitution didn't matter in this sense. It didn't matter at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Who cares?
Yeah, the Constitution could have said anything, and at the end of the day, they would have had a big problem to solve, a social problem, because of the organizing. And I think that's really the key, is the sort of front-facing message is a bit playful, kind of a joke, right? Like, yeah, this is just a fight for free speech, I don't know. But in reality, it's a fight for a lot more than that, right? The IWW did kind of the same thing with the religion that I find really funny. Like, they would go to jail, and if you go to jail, they would ask you, what's your religion? And they would say, the IWW. And then they would try to play that off as like a way to get like religious freedom, and their religion is based around like getting people to strike. So again, just like very funny and silly. But that's what's so great about it. There's a seriousness there, right? They're tapping into something that is a legal mechanism that could be strategically deployed, but there's more happening. I don't know. I love that stuff. I love how goofy the Wobblies are.
Yeah, totally. They're goofy and strategic and very smart in the end, and also like just willing to throw it all down, right? Like,
yeah,
that a bunch of people just show up and be willing to get arrested is wild. I mean,
it's just
cool.
It's just like these Harper's Letter signatories who are willing to go to Twitter jail over their convictions.
Not even Twitter jail, just cancel jail. Just like, it's just an imaginary kind of thing that they have made up themselves that they have to go.
That's right.
When we get mad at
them. Yeah. This Harper's essay or open letter could have just said, wanted people to fill the canceled jails. And all these people showed up. So pretty much the same thing.
That's right. The Harper's letter is the jail if you think about it, because like these people, they've been canceled by it.
That's right. I want to talk about another example that just kind of is not about speech, but illustrates the same general point or theme here. And that is the Black Panther Party. Another really great example if you're looking for like people who call the bluff of liberalism. The Black Panther Party was started in the late 60s by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale and some other folks. And what I love about them, which I think is sometimes an underplayed aspect of them, is that Huey P. Newton actually had a bachelor's degree in law and was pretty gifted at understanding the law, actually. And some of the things that the Panthers did were really, really based in, again, calling the bluff of American liberalism. The most famous one is gun rights, right? So if you see a picture of the Panthers or you know anything about them, probably the most famous thing is that they have leather jackets and they carry around big guns. And those guns they had so that they could do cop watches, and they rooted it in the constitutional right to bear arms. That was the idea. So the premise was if you feel threatened by the state, the government gives you a legal mechanism by which you can defend yourself, and that's what Black communities needed in California, they said, so that's just what they'll do. What's so fascinating about this is it didn't really take long for Republicans, the classic defenders of gun laws, to turn on the Panthers and abandon that freedom. So in 1967, there was a famous act called the Mulford Act that was passed in California that repealed a law that allowed people to carry guns publicly, and it was named after this guy, Don Mulford, who was a Republican. But also Ronald Reagan signed it into law. He was the governor of California at the time. And what I think is so fascinating about that sort of story is that Reagan ends up being the hero of libertarian notions of freedom in the 80s as the president. But in 67, he is using his political authority to actually restrict somebody's constitutional freedoms, because this is a case of people who are not the ruling class having the means to defend themselves. And the story really dramatizes, I think, that liberal freedoms matter until they actually matter, right? They matter as a way of shoring up the authority of the ruling class, but if things really get serious, they don't really matter in a significant way, or at least they don't matter until it's too late. Just to sort of drive the point home, the Panthers, if you read their literature, you'll definitely find all kinds of good stuff about Marxism and Leninism and all the rest of it. But there's a really, really interesting thread where the Panthers draw, again, sort of playfully on the U.S. political tradition. And if you read, for example, the 1966 party program, a lot of it is literally just appealing to like the U.S. Constitution. There's a bit in it where all right, I have it in front of me. Point 9 in the program is they say, we want all Black people, when brought to trial, to be tried in court by a jury of their peer group or people from the Black communities as defined by the Constitution of the United States. They go on to say more about that, but they root it directly in the 14th Amendment. They talk again about the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms elsewhere. They close the whole program saying that they hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, directly quoting from all these revolutionary documents of the American Revolution. And all that to say, I think what the Panthers reveal is that the U.S. is built on all kinds of notions of liberal freedom, but it actually operates much differently. And if you try to push those notions in a revolutionary direction, you'll discover that actually they're not there to protect you. So all that to say, to bring it back to the Harper's thing, I think it just sort of casts doubt on whether or not these, lofty, noble truths, in fact, are universal, and whether or not they should be even.
Yeah, totally. I think it does explicate the whole situation, right? Just it shows you how they work and where they break down. It's pretty good, man. When you're reading that, the stuff from the Panther Party program, it's just like it would never even occur to me to think about the Constitution with regards to politics. I don't know. Maybe I'm like so much of a cynic, or like maybe just like too stupid to realize. But like, I just would never even like, oh yeah, the Constitution is political, has political ideas in it. It's beyond me sometimes. I forget about that altogether.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess I just have such a low expectation that any of those things would be enforced.
Right.
But I'll maybe, yeah, I don't get that kind of stuff. It doesn't work in my brain because of my weird imagination. But the things that do, mostly come from Karl Marx. So let's talk about Marx and freedom.
Yeah, so let's transition a bit, maybe talking about the general problem with liberal freedom, and then we can ask old Dr. Carl for his opinion. So I think what, at least for me, the IWW and the Panthers and so many other examples reveal is that liberal freedoms are ideas that people like to hold dear, and they like to talk about them being universal, and maybe people even genuinely believe that, right? They believe that all sides should be heard, etc. But when push comes to shove in the actual day-to-day realities of politics, we learn that those kinds of notions of freedom don't really hold in a political economy that is built, for the advantages of some people and the disadvantage of others. So the presumptions to ideals of equality in freedom, bourgeois freedom, don't make sense if your entire society is built around trying to make sure that people are not equal, built around keeping people in unequal situations. I don't know. Anything else you want to say about liberal freedom before we ask Marx for some alternative?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could also probably draw out a little bit too how liberal freedoms are also like racialized in some pretty
Yeah.
serious ways, right? I mean, it's very obvious with the Black Panther Party, right? Like, of course, Republicans would get like nervous um, when Black people with some very radical ideas start carrying guns. Of course, like that's the time they'd pay attention, right? Because that's like an actual threat to the status quo, or it could be. And the same thing with the IWW, but like in a different way, right? Uh, in the case of the IWW, it's racialized in a strange, like a way that's a little bit more foreign to our particular way of thinking about race right now. But like and then it would have been about uh, immigrants coming from Europe rather than Black people, which there's way different dynamics going on there and stuff. But all that to say is that like when the idea of whiteness is questioned by some kind of force, that's when those freedoms break down.
Yeah, there is also a really interesting case if you want to bring those together. I mean, there's probably lots of cases, but the one that always comes to mind for me is George Washington Woodby, who we've talked about on this podcast before.
Oh,
He
right, yeah.
was, a black pastor who was the sole black delegate to the Socialist Party USA's conventions in, I forget, the early 20th century. But anyway, he himself got involved in a bunch of free speech fights and worked with the IWW in California on them. Like they showed up for him and vice versa. And he kept ending up in jail for a bunch of reasons, but not least because he was a black socialist saying that people should be socialists, and
Hmm.
he got like kicked out of his church and everything else. So anyway, there's a lot of really interesting ways in which the bridge between those things are not too far. But I mean, you're absolutely right that anyway, absolutely right that the history of racialization is bizarre, but the minute you question whiteness in particular is when you get in big trouble.
Yeah, exactly. All right, what does this Marx guy have to say about this?
That's a great question.
That is a great question. He has a few things to say. A lot of different places to start. As I mean, he wrote a lot of stuff, so you could start a lot of different places. But let's start with the Communist Manifesto because that's the thing that I like the most. So, in the Communist Manifesto, this is in part 2, in case you're playing the home game, in which you have a big Karl Marx book in front of you, and you're following along as we quote these things,
And a big bingo sheet.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so this is what Marx has to say about freedom in the manifesto. Marx is mostly talking about the freedom of property, but he thinks like that idea about bourgeois ideas about property like end up bleeding out into all these other like ideas of freedom in society. So this is what Marx says: don't wrangle with us as long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, and law. Don't wrangle with us is the funniest thing that Karl Marx could possibly have said. Anyway, so he's okay.
What do you think?
Don't.
Sorry, what do you think the German word for "don't wrangle with us" is?
That's a great question. I wish I knew. So Marx is saying, don't wrangle with us as long as you think, as long as you want to apply bourgeois ideas to our abolition of bourgeois things. Don't bother with it. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economic conditions of the existence of your class. Okay, so I mean, what Marx is getting at here is pretty clear. First of all, don't wrangle with him. Second of all, um, all of these ideas about freedom that we have when it comes to our entire society, they are all premised off the you know bourgeois interests, right? Bourgeois production, bourgeois property, and the freedoms that surround those things are all codified into law by, you guessed it, the bourgeoisie. So like, if we're gonna abolish the private property, if we're gonna do this big class war, then we can't maintain these these silly bourgeois ideas of freedom because they're gonna weigh us down. Don't even bother wrangling with us if you think these things.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a sense in which the ideas that we have are reflections of the societies we live in.
Hmm.
There's stronger and less strong ways of saying that in Marxism, but I think the basic point is really enough that if you live in a society that is unequal, you should at least be a little bit cautious about your so-called common sense because it's built out of an unequal society. And I
Right.
think that's really helpful when talking about bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, law, etc., as Marx talks about, because these are all things that uphold that order of injustice. I mean, there's certainly a lot you could say, right? Maybe some bourgeois notions of freedom are better than others, or something like that. It's not like everybody agrees, but I think Marx is absolutely right to at least make us question the relationship between the societies that we're all formed by and the kind of ideas that we just take for granted.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that's like the connection between the point of this quote though is right is to map out just what you just said, the that production and private property are mapped on directly to these other ideas of freedom, right? So that's interesting. That's a good kind of note to stick in our head, a good flag for us. I think what's interesting though is that in other places Marx has actually articulated maybe more about what freedom looks like for him, and I think that's actually pretty fascinating.
Hmm.
So this comes from another book that Marx wrote called The German Ideology. One of my faves. Anyways, in this one, Marx is talking a little bit more positively or a little bit more like explicitly about like and like what personal freedom kind of like looks like, or like what the conditions are for personal freedom. And it's
Hmm.
interesting. It's a way that Marx doesn't often talk in some of the more political writings. So in the German Ideology, Marx writes this: only in community has each individual the means of cultivating his or her gifts in all directions. Only in the community, therefore, are personal freedoms possible. In the previous substitutes for the community and the state, etc., personal freedom has existed only for the individual who developed within the relationships of the ruling class, and only insofar as they were individuals of this class. All right, this is cool. So, personal freedom. We all think we have it, but guess what? Only the rich have it. Only the people who, only the bourgeois class has it. Because, if you want to be a painter, you want to be a sculptor, you want to be a shoemaker. I don't know. You want to learn how to play the
So
guitar.
you want to
You,
be a shoemaker?
well, yeah, you better be in the ruling class. But like, all these things, right? You can only really follow the passions of your personal freedom if you have the means by which you can do so, right? The personal freedom here means like if you have money where you can like take a lot of time off work to practice playing guitar rather than working or whatever. Practice making shoes rather than working. I've been working in the shoe factory all day. I don't have time to make
Yeah,
shoes
yeah.
at home.
Apologies to the shoemaker caucus that listens to this podcast. I'm sure they're all going to be very upset. A lot of angry emails.
Yeah, that's right. But what's cool here is that only in community, when people all have sort of like the ability to rely on one another in the economic sense, in the productive sense, can people actually cultivate their own gifts when they're socialized to have a society where only the ruling class doesn't have enough time to spend like exploring what they actually want to do. Okay, this is like maybe a more banal way of thinking about it, but like I was thinking about when I was in college and I was trying to decide what major I wanted to be, and I picked majors like, and I changed them constantly because I had no idea like what I really wanted to do, and there was like really no structure set up for me to like understand what I wanted to do, and I just kept picking things until I found something until I graduated basically. And I guess like it's just like so bonkers. There's not even like really a space for that in the present, culture. Like what space do you have if you're not like wealthy and you have time to kind of like figure it out for yourself, to really figure out like what it is like you like and like that you want to do and that you're good at. It's so
Mhm.
weird. That's like the way that we have, that's the way that we've just kind of like done it. That's the way we're gonna keep doing it. That people don't really have the time to even like know what they like before they pick, accounting or something in
Yeah.
college. That's such a profoundly sad idea. The more that I think about it.
Yeah, for sure. The text that this is from, also the German ideology, has the famous quote that people like to pull out of it, where I haven't committed it to memory, but the way it goes is something like under communism, like you could go fishing in the morning, you could go do some theory in the evening, you could, I don't know, do a different job in the afternoon without ever becoming a fisherman or a theorist or whatever. That you'd have the freedom to be able to explore these different parts of yourself under communism. And I think that's really interesting too, right? That Marx isn't actually against having a sort of personal expression of freedom or like individuality or personality. It's rather that he thinks capitalism is in fact against those things, even though it pays lip service to them in these bizarre kind of ways with like inconsistent ideas about who deserves freedom or where it should be applied and that sort of thing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like, how could you possibly be free in capitalism? Because like most of your day is going to be spent making sure you can pay your rent and making sure that you have like
Right.
electricity and making sure you've got food and like clothes. That's not freedom. That's just like it's freedom only for people who have the means to afford freedom, right? And
Right.
it sucks.
Yeah, I think too, this idea in Marxism is good to talk about, that there is a real space for freedom in Marxism. But one also has to be careful not to overinflate it. Like, it always really bothers me to hear the like fully automated space communism rhetoric,
Mm.
because it's basically like, what if we all had like extremely bourgeois freedoms, but like in the future, and we could all just sort of consume whatever we wanted. And the reason I dislike it is not because I don't want to be able to enjoy whatever our society can produce, but because any kind of socialism that would ever be achieved in my lifetime, especially, would not be a utopic, fully automated system. If we know anything from the history of actually existing socialism and communism, it would be one where probably a lot of the freedoms that you enjoy right now would have to be restricted in certain ways so that you could really balance out the scales and allow other people to have some freedoms and think a little bit harder about, what freedom of speech means. For example, are you really more free if you can say whatever you want, or are you more free if you live in a society where you know that people won't be saying things that are racist? Right? These are questions that I think the history of Marxism forces us to ask, and it impinges on liberalism, and it also impinges on certain kind of utopic visions of socialism that I think are, I don't know, they leave behind all the lessons that we've learned from how hard it is to actually pull this off.
Yeah, totally. We don't need to get in depth into the luxury space communism stuff too, but something that I think is actually really problematic is kind of along the lines of what you're saying, but some of the idea is to that too is like that you don't have to change your patterns of consumption, which I think is extremely
Right.
problematic as well. Because like the idea in some of those ways of thinking, I don't want to like put anyone on blast particularly because I haven't prepared any specific ideas, but it's that like, it'd be too hard at this point to rearrange like consumptive desires. So instead we should just rearrange production and like we'll just keep on consuming like we consume. But like how about you don't? Cuz like it, it's such a problem to do that for a lot of reasons. I mean like environmental reasons for sure, but but also like you know if Marxism isn't really calling into question like what actual needs are or what
Hmm.
actual freedoms are more necessary than others, then like what are you doing? It just seems like
Yeah.
such a self-reflective piece that's missing from that type of discourse.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Well, let's think about a place where all this stuff actually matters. And when I like to do that, I always think about Cuba in particular. And what's so great about Cuba is we can talk about Marxism and Christianity at the same time because of a longtime friend of the show who's never been on it, but it's kind of one of these one-way friendships. We really like him. He probably doesn't know that we exist. Fray Beto, the Dominican Catholic priest from Brazil. We talked about actually these thoughts a long time ago, like I think back in February or something of this year, which feels like 1,000 years ago. But it's still good, and it's good in this context. So we promised we are going to talk about Christianity and Marxism. Listen, we're going to talk about both of them at once via Beto, and here we go. So in an interview earlier this year, Fray Beto was asked, what do you say to people who say that in Cuba there isn't any freedom? And Beto says, I always say to these people and their employees, what freedom do they have? Presuming the employees of somebody asking that question who doesn't live in Cuba. In Cuba, people have freedom, but not in the capitalist sense, with a small minority who have freedom from everything and the majority who do not have the freedom to live in decent conditions or to put their children in school, to have good treatment of their health, or the ability to move around the world. In Cuba, there's no individual tourism, but if a cultural group needs to travel, the state itself finances the trip. Everything has to have a social meaning. This is correct. In my country, which is Brazil, only a small minority has the possibility to travel, and the majority are still unable to move, even internally. I think what's so great about this quote is Beto is basically putting in a much more digestible form all the stuff we were just talking about with Marx, right? That what kind of freedom exists under capitalism and what kind of freedom exists under socialism. And I think what he's really helping us see is that in Cuba, it's not the case that there isn't freedom. It's the case that freedom looks different because it has different priorities, it has different interests, and it's understood to be a collective project and not an individual one. And at least for me, I mean, there's good Marxist reasons to think that, but it's always like, why does Fray Beto, a Catholic priest, think that? And I think that's suggestive that, maybe there's something in Christianity that's also, I don't think guarantees that you're going to have a good idea of freedom, obviously, because a lot of Christians have bad ones. But there are lots of resources in Christianity that point you to a more expansive and more collective horizon when we think about freedom. And I think Beto just kind of like exemplifies all that together.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, we could spend a lot more time talking about the weird theologies of individualism within Christianity, but let's not. It's a topic for another time. It's a topic for another episode. Um, but so to steer myself away from this jumble of words I've just started saying, let me read another quote from Fray Beto about socialism.
Good.
Socialism can be thought of as a system of material abundance for all as they did in Eastern European socialism. Today, it's recognized as a mistake, but we have to think of socialism as a spiritual abundance. That is, even if there are difficulties, people will understand that the difficulties are for everyone, which are caused by the fact of socialism coexisting with a world of competition, selfishness, exploitation, that is, a capitalist world. And from there, you find ways to overcome these ideas until you discover that in socialism, as the word affirms, social rights are above personal rights, but in which personal potentialities can also develop without putting contradiction between one and another. It is much more humanizing, much more loving, above all a way attending to this fundamental desire of all of us, which is to conquer happiness. Um, conquer happiness is a funny phrase, but this is good. What Fabio is saying here is really interesting, right? And it does kind of speak to the religious elements of socialism, um, that I think you get in some of Marx's writing, but Beto puts it in a way better way. Right, Marx has the idea of species being, about this like whole sense of humanity as like a coherent sort of thing, but Beto has it in a more a way that makes more sense and it's less German. Right, that everyone understands that it might be difficult because we can't all have, we all can't have luxury space communism or whatever. We all can't drive a Tesla and have 1,000 pizzas every day. But we understand like those shortcomings, those problems are because of other things, the selfishness of the world, exploitation, capitalism, etc. But I like the idea though that like you know in socialism, it's like you just get it, right? You get that everyone's rights are really more important than just your own. And yeah, I don't know. There's a cool spiritual quality to those things that I think is worth thinking about more.
Hmm. Yeah, I think so too. And I think too it encourages us to think more about Christianity's expansion of the idea of freedom too, right? Like you said, there's a lot of ways that Christians have contributed to individualist notions of freedom, and someday we'll talk about those. But it's also like Christianity has a lot of weird ideas about freedom, and many of them are definitely not individualist, or they sort of oppose individualism. Better to think is sort of exhibiting one, but I always think about like I don't know. There's a lot of notions in Christianity of freedom that can be problematic, but nevertheless, sort of point freedom to you're only truly free if you're living a sort of a godly life, if you will, which is to say, you're only free if you're living in accordance with whatever the good that God wants for the world, or a just kind of way of living. And of course, there's lots of reactionary ways of interpreting that, no doubt about it. But I think if you understand Christianity as a paradigm for thinking about right relationships and really doing justice in the world, then that also changes the way you think about freedom. That you only really live freely if you feel like you're living in a society where there is justice and there is peace and those sorts of things. And it seems to me that socialism helps to achieve those Christian ideas of freedom too. Like, you're not more free if you just have the ability to do whatever you want. You're more free if you have the ability to do the good or to do what's right. And, I always think of like an example of if you're like, when I was a little kid, I went to go touch a really hot stove, and my mom was like, don't do that because you're going to burn your hands. And I did it anyway because I had the freedom to do it, I guess, and I burnt my hand. And the big question is like, when my mom is telling me not to burn my hand, is she impinging on my freedom by taking away my freedom to hurt myself? I don't think so, right? Like, this is a prohibition that's actually trying to help me lead a life where I'm free from the harm of burning my hand, and free to live a life where I'm healthy and don't have to worry about a burn. It's a small example, but I think Christianity and socialism both kind of get us thinking in that direction, right? What kind of limitations and opportunities do we have to affirm if we really want to lead a life that's free to be healthy with ourselves and with one another? And at least for me, I think what's great is Christianity can set you on a path to think about that stuff, but sooner or later you will have to ask weird questions about society and production, and that's where socialism is kind of a necessary thing you got to engage.
Yeah, that's right. This is, I guess, a weird left field tangent, but that's all we do on this podcast, I think. I remember this one time it was a class in college about the Synoptic Gospels, and we were reading through the book of Matthew, and there's this part in there where Jesus is just like, he's talking about all of the unrepentant cities and how like they're all going to go to hell. And I remember in the class, like we were talking about this, and the professor was like, "Okay, what do you think about Jesus though condemning the entire city?" And everyone in the class was like, "No, this is not good. You cannot do this, Jesus, please," because all of us like very evangelical Christian college students were just like losing it that Jesus could like send an entire city to hell just because like most people there are bad or something. And anyways, it was a really funny moment because like, that's not how any of us like silly evangelical college kids thought about salvation or Christianity or even like politics, right? We think of them as completely individualistic, right? Like, as long as I'm doing the good things and I'm having a very personal relationship with Jesus and I'm doing the right things politically or whatever, everything's chill. But there's this like this maybe it's not untapped, but for me it still is an untapped power in like the idea of like collective sins that like you're culpable for the society that you live in, even though it might be a hard thing to understand.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, let's bring this all the way back to Harper's Magazine. And how we're going to get there, I'm not sure. I haven't planned it. But I'm going to say some words, and maybe they'll end up making a connection. All right.
Don't
so we're
wrangle
talking
with
about
us.
how...
That's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, don't wrangle with
Harpers.
us. You think that you're getting wrangled with, but you don't even know what it means to be wrangled with. not like the IWW, not like Karl Marx. I mean, I think like in any case, I guess what I find really valuable about thinking about Marx and Beto and these other kind of more expansive ideas of freedom is that it stops you from saying ridiculous things like my freedoms are being attacked because a teen with a skateboard avatar is saying that I should eat a butt on the internet, right? Like it stops you from having ridiculous ideas like that, and it also encourages you to think of freedom as something that isn't something that you like protect by publishing an open letter, but something that you have to fight for by building a society where you can actually live in it. And that is not the kind of thing that it seems like this Harper's essay is really trying to build.
Yeah, totally. I think this Harper's essay is mostly worried about being made fun of on the internet by teens, just like you said. Right. Boner Guy 420 is out there, and he is dunking on David Brooks every day, and David Brooks has had enough of it. But yeah, I think
He's
that's
tired
right.
of it. All he wants to do is finally say the one racist thing that'll get him canceled, and he wants to survive it.
That's right, and we can't let him. We can't let them at all.
That's right.
Oh man,
400 Twitter teens wanted to go to jail to tell David Brooks to eat a butt.
That's right. Okay, so I guess in conclusion, bourgeois freedom, it's not great.
That's right. What a strong, resounding, forceful conclusion. The IWW soapbox would be proud, I think.
If I was in the IWW, I would sing a song about it, though. But I won't do that. I won't do that for this podcast because I don't want to be canceled.
That's right. So the best part about doing a podcast is if you want to cancel us, you have to. If you want to cancel me, you have to email Matt, and if you want to cancel Matt, you have to email me, and we'll never cancel each other because we both hold the key to the other's cancellation. So it's a mutually assured cancellation.
That's right. All right, this podcast is now over.
It's canceled. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard and you don't want us to be canceled, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. You can find us on Twitter at the Magnificast. You can email us at themagnificast@gmail.com. We have a Facebook group that we haven't posted in a long time called the Magnificast Basement, but it's still around. Let's see. What else can I say? Nothing. Our music is by Amoria Armstrong, and our outro is by the Illogical Spoon. See you next week.
Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early.